There is a moment in every person's life when the ground beneath their feet disappears. Not slowly, not with warning. It happens all at once, like a floor giving way in the middle of the night. You were standing, then you were not, and no one around you even noticed. This is not a story about war. It is not a story about soldiers or flags or medals placed on folded cloth. This is a story about a gate, a woman standing in front of it, and a young man in uniform who could have opened it, but didn't. What he knew, he could not say out loud. What she needed, she could not stop chasing. And somewhere between the iron bars and the silence, the truth was waiting for both of them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Camilla remembered that detail with strange precision, the way the mind holds onto small things when the large ones are too heavy to carry. It was a Tuesday in October, cool enough to need a jacket but not cold enough to bother finding one. She had been standing at the kitchen counter, coffee half made, listening to the morning radio the way she always did when Marcus was away, filling the silence with something that wasn't quite company but wasn't quite nothing either. The knock at the door was soft, almost apologetic. She remembered thinking that odd, how someone could knock on a door in a way that felt sorry before they even said a word. She set down her mug. She walked to the door. She opened it. Two uniformed officers stood on her porch. One was older, with a face that had learned to carry the weight of these visits without flinching. The other was young, barely past 20, and his jaw was tight in the way of someone trying not to feel what they were feeling. They had their hats in their hands. That was when Camilla's body understood what her mind had not yet accepted. Her legs went first, not buckling, not collapsing dramatically the way it happens in movies, just quietly giving, like something loosening at the joints. The older officer reached forward and caught her arm. She did not cry, not right away. She stood there in the doorway with the October air moving through the kitchen behind her, and she listened to the words that she already knew were coming. Marcus James Aldridge, killed in action, a mission she was not cleared to know the details of. His body had not yet been recovered. That was the part they said quickly, as if speed would make it easier to hear. His body had not yet been recovered. She would receive his personal effects within 10 to 14 business days. She nodded. She thanked them. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a very long time. Camilla and Marcus had been together for 11 years. They had met at a state fair when she was 23 and he was 25, both reaching for the same paper bag of kettle corn at a vendor stall, both pulling back at the same time, both laughing. It was the kind of beginning that sounds like something from a story, because it was. He was broad-shouldered with a quiet voice and a habit of looking at people like he was genuinely interested in what they had to say. She was stubborn, funny, and completely unbothered by the things that used to bother other people she dated. They fit together in the way that real things fit, not perfectly, not without friction, but honestly. He had been in the military when they met. She had known what she was signing up for. She had told herself that 100 times over the years, each deployment, each goodbye. She thought she had understood the shape of the risk. She had not. No one ever really does until the men in uniform show up at the door with their hats in their hands. In the days that followed, Camilla did what people do. She made calls. She received calls. She sat through casseroles delivered by neighbors and long silences with her mother on the phone. She sorted through nothing and decided nothing and slept barely at all. But somewhere underneath the grief, something else was working, something quieter and harder. She could not sit still with the idea of no body, no confirmation, no place to put her eyes. The military had told her that recovery operations were ongoing, that she would be notified, that these things took time. She did not want time. She wanted an answer. 10 days after the officers appeared at her door, a box arrived containing Marcus's watch, a folded photograph of the two of them taken at their wedding, and 3 letters she had sent him that he had kept bound with a rubber band. She held each item carefully, the way you hold things that belong to a person you love when you are no longer sure where that person is. Then she put them back in the box. She closed the lid. She went to the bedroom and she pulled out the address she had written down from the notification letter. The base where Marcus had been stationed, 2 states away. She made a decision then, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet certainty that only grief can produce. She was going to that base. She was going to stand in front of whoever would speak to her, and she was going to ask every question she had not been allowed to ask over the phone. She was going to get an answer. She left before sunrise the next morning. She drove through flat land and low clouds and a silence that stretched for miles. She did not play music. She did not call anyone. She just drove, her hands steady on the wheel, her jaw set, her eyes forward. She had no way of knowing that the answer she was looking for was closer than she thought. She had no way of knowing that it was standing at a gate, in a uniform, waiting, even if it did not know it was waiting. She drove through the morning and into the afternoon, and by the time the trees thinned and the flat open land gave way to fencing and security towers, she had already rehearsed what she would say 100 times. She had Marcus's name ready. She had her identification ready. She had her grief ready, pressed down and contained, because she had learned that grief worn openly in these places made people look past you rather than at you. She pulled up to the entrance. She rolled down her window. She looked at the sentry standing at the gate. And everything stopped. The sentry's name was Private Daniel Hayes. He was 24 years old, 5 feet 11, with a face that still looked younger than his rank suggested and eyes that had recently learned to look older than his age allowed. He had been stationed at this gate for 3 weeks, reassigned after a mission that had taken something from him. Not a limb, not visible blood, but something interior and harder to name. He did his job quietly. He followed his orders precisely. He stood at the gate in the gray afternoon light, and he watched the dust-covered car pull up to the barrier. And when the window rolled down and he saw the woman behind the wheel, something inside him locked up like a door slamming shut. He knew her face. Not personally, but he had seen her photograph more times than he could count. Marcus kept it in his breast pocket, a small printed photo laminated at the edges where it had softened from handling. Every time something got hard, every time the noise and the dust and the waiting became too much, Marcus would take out that photograph, look at it for 10 seconds, and put it away again. He never made a big deal of it. He never talked about it too much. That was Marcus's way. He loved things quietly and completely and without announcement. Camilla said her name clearly. She explained who she was. She said she was a wife of Marcus James Aldridge, that she had received notification of his death, and that she needed to speak to someone in charge about his remains and the details of his mission. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were direct. Daniel could see the grief sitting inside her like a stone she had been carrying for days. Heavy, unmoving, real. He looked at her identification. He looked at her face. He looked back at the barrier arm in front of her car. He said he was sorry, but he could not let her through. Not today. She asked why. He said access to the base required prior authorization and an approved visit request submitted through the proper channels. She had not submitted one. Without an approval code, he could not lift the barrier. She said she understood the process. She said she had called ahead. She said she had spoken to someone in the administrative office who had told her she could come in and fill out the necessary paperwork in person. She produced a name, a date, a time. Daniel said he had no record of that. He said he was sorry. He said she would need to contact the administrative office again and have the visit formally processed before he could authorize entry. Camilla was quiet for a moment. She looked at him with something that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but something layered between the two. She said she had driven 6 hours. She said she just wanted to talk to someone who knew her husband. She said she was not asking to go through classified files or enter a restricted area. She just wanted to speak with someone who could tell her something real, something more than what had been written in a letter that sounded like it had been typed by a machine. Daniel held the line. He was not following protocol in that moment. Not entirely. He was following something else, a command that had been given to him before he took his post at this gate, in a quiet room by an officer whose face he would not easily forget. The officer had handed him a photograph. The photograph was of Camilla, not in a threatening way, not like surveillance, more like a warning being passed between people who shared an uncomfortable secret. The officer had said, quietly and without elaboration, that if this woman showed up at the gate, she was not to be let through. Not without clearing it with him personally, directly, immediately. Daniel had asked why. The officer had looked at him for a moment with the kind of weight that comes from carrying information that changes the shape of everything around it. He had said only that there were things in motion that needed time. that letting her in before those things were settled could cause a harm that neither of them would be able to undo. And then he had walked away, leaving Daniel at the gate with the photograph and a growing pressure in his chest that had not left since. He had thought about that conversation every day. He had turned it over and over in the way you turn something that doesn't sit right, looking for the angle that makes it easier to hold. He had not found one. Camilla did not leave. She sat in her car on the other side of the barrier for almost an hour. Daniel watched her without watching her, in the way you monitor something in your peripheral vision because looking directly at it costs too much. She was on her phone at one point, her head down, her free hand pressing flat against the dashboard as if she needed something solid. At another point, she just sat still, staring through the windshield at nothing. He wondered what she was thinking. He wondered if she could feel how wrong this was. Not the gate, not the rules, not the bureaucratic wall between her and the base, but the deeper wrongness underneath all of it, the thing that no set of procedures could quite contain. After an hour, she started her car. She did not look at him as she turned around. She did not yell or cry or say anything dramatic. She simply left, her taillights disappearing down the long road that led back to everything the military had decided she should know and away from everything it had decided she should not. Daniel stood at his post for the rest of his shift. He followed his orders. He stood straight. He did not let the feeling in his chest become anything he had to act on. But when his replacement arrived and he was finally free to walk away from the barrier, he sat alone in the break room for a long time and thought about the photograph in Marcus's breast pocket. The one he kept there like an anchor. The one he took out and looked at when things got hard. He thought about what it meant that Marcus had kept it there. He thought about what it meant that Camilla had driven 6 hours to stand at a gate and ask for answers. He thought about what he knew and what she didn't. And he thought about how long a person could hold on to something that heavy before it started to pull them under. The truth was not a simple thing. It never is, when it has been locked inside someone long enough to grow edges. Daniel Hayes had been on the ground that night. He had been part of the extraction team, positioned 200 meters east of the primary target zone, tasked with providing cover as the forward unit moved through the building. He had heard the explosion before he saw the light from it. It was the kind of blast that changes the air pressure, that makes your ears go flat and your vision strobe white for a moment before the world reassembles itself into something you can process. By the time he could see again, there was dust and shouting and the particular kind of radio silence that means the situation has gone beyond what the radio was prepared to carry. Marcus had been inside the building. That was the first truth. The second truth was that Marcus had not died in that building. He had been pulled out of the rubble by 2 members of the forward unit who were themselves injured. He had been breathing, badly, unevenly, in the way that makes the men around you go very quiet because they know how to read a breath and what they are reading is a close call in real time. He had been airlifted out within the hour. That part Daniel had not witnessed directly, but he had heard it confirmed on the ground that night and again in the debrief room the following morning. The third truth was harder. Marcus was alive, but the word alive was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The blast had done significant damage to his spine, to his left side, to the left half of his face. The medical report, which Daniel had not been authorized to read but which had been described to him in careful fragments by the unit medic, suggested that Marcus was in a specialized rehabilitation facility attached to the base, a ward that most people on that base did not know existed, funded under a budget line that did not use the word medical and did not appear in the documents given to next of kin. The notification letter sent to Camilla had said he was killed in action. That letter had been sent before the extraction was confirmed, in the confusion of the first 12 hours after the blast, when the information on the ground was still incomplete and official channels were moving faster than the facts. By the time the extraction was confirmed, by the time the medical picture became clearer, the letter had already arrived. And somewhere in the machinery of military administration, a decision had been made, not by one person, not dramatically, but in the way that decisions are made in bureaucracies through a series of small choices and delayed updates and quiet redirections, to not immediately correct the notification. The reason given, in the brief and careful language of the officer who had spoken to Daniel, was that Marcus's condition was considered classified pending a full medical assessment and a determination of his long-term prognosis. Until the military could determine what Marcus's future looked like, they could not make any official statement that contradicted the notification letter. The legal and procedural implications of notifying a next of kin that their spouse was alive and then having to walk that back, if Marcus did not survive the weeks ahead, were considered too complex to navigate without a completed medical picture. Daniel understood the logic. That was the worst part. He understood it the way you understand a machine. He could see how the parts fit together and why each one moved the way it did. But understanding a machine does not make it right. It just makes you complicit in the way it runs. He had not been ordered to lie. Not directly. He had been ordered only to delay. To manage the gate. To make sure Camilla did not gain access to the base until the medical team had completed their assessment. Until the officer in charge had cleared the case for next of kin notification. Until the paperwork was done and the language was prepared and the whole situation was controlled enough to be released. That was what the officer had called it. Releasing the situation. As if information were a thing you could hold in your hands until the right moment. Daniel had gone along with it. He had lifted no barriers. He had held his post. But Camilla had come back. She came back the second day. She had submitted the visit request the officer had mentioned. He did not know exactly how, whether by phone or by a form sent through official channels, but by 9 in the morning she was at the gate again with a printed confirmation number. He had called it in. He had been told the request was still processing. He had relayed this to Camilla through his window with his face as neutral as he could manage. She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, that she had done everything they asked. She was just trying to find out what happened to her husband. She was not here to cause problems. She was here because he was her husband and she loved him and she could not sit in her house and wait for a phone call that was never going to tell her the whole truth. Daniel had nodded. He had said he understood. He had not lifted the barrier. She came back the third day. And the fourth. By the fourth day, something had shifted in the space between them. She was no longer explaining herself at the window. He was no longer reciting policy. They looked at each other in the way of two people who have reached the outer edge of formal language and are standing at the border of something more honest. She asked him, on the fourth day, why he seemed sorry. She said it directly, without preamble, the way people do when they have run out of patience for everything that isn't the point. She said he looked like someone who wanted to say something and wasn't saying it. She asked if he knew her husband. He said he did not. She looked at him, long enough that he felt the weight of the look, the way it pressed against the thing he was holding inside. Then she said, with a steadiness that cost her something to maintain, that she was going to come back every day until someone at this gate told her the truth. Not the processed version. Not the language that had been prepared for situations like hers. The actual truth. Whatever it was. She said she could handle the actual truth. What she could not handle was the silence. She drove away. Daniel stood at the gate and felt the thing he had been carrying shift in his chest like a stone rolling to a new position. Still heavy, but pointing somewhere different now. He made a decision that night, alone in his bunk, staring at the ceiling in the dark. He did not know yet exactly what the decision would look like. He did not know how much it would cost him. But he knew that 5 days from now, if Camilla Aldridge drove up to that gate again, something was going to be different. He could not give her everything, but he could give her direction. He could give her enough that she would find her own way to the truth without him having to be the one who handed it to her directly. It was not courage exactly, but it was the closest thing to it he had managed since that night in the dust and the flat silence and the breathing that sounded all wrong. He closed his eyes. He thought about the photograph in Marcus's pocket. He thought about what it meant to love something quietly and completely without announcement. And in the dark of his bunk on that 5th night, he made his peace with what came next. She came back on the 5th day. She did not look like a woman who had been sleeping. She looked like a woman who had stopped pretending that sleep was available to her and had simply gotten up from the bed and kept moving. There were dark patches under her eyes and a stillness in her face that was not calm. It was something that had moved past calm and arrived somewhere quieter and more determined on the other side. She pulled up to the gate at 7:40 in the morning. Daniel was already on shift. He watched her car approach and he felt the decision he had made the night before pressing against the back of his ribs, making itself known, reminding him that it was still there and still waiting to be acted on. She rolled down the window. She looked at him. He walked to the car and leaned in slightly, the way you lean when you want to make sure that what you're saying goes only where you intend it to go and nowhere else. He did not look directly at her. He kept his eyes forward, as if checking the road behind her car. His voice, when he spoke, was low and level and did not sound like a man delivering information. It sounded like a man making casual conversation about nothing in particular. He said that the administrative building to the right of the main entrance had an annex attached at the back that most visitors never noticed. He said the annex had its own entrance on the service road that ran parallel to the perimeter fence, beginning about a quarter-mile north of the main gate and ending at a secondary checkpoint that handled supply deliveries on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He said that the checkpoint operated with a different staffing rotation and processed requests under a separate administrative code than the one her visit application had been routed through. He said that if she had a specific reason to believe her original application had been misfiled, if she were to contact the administrative clerk at that checkpoint and mention a specific case number, a case number that began with the letters RM and was followed by the sequence she would find if she looked carefully at the bottom left corner of the original notification letter she had been sent, she might find that her access situation resolved itself in a way that the main gate could not facilitate. He said all of this in approximately 4 to 5 seconds. Then he stepped back, asked to see her identification in a normal tone of voice, inspected it briefly, and told her that he was sorry but her visit authorization had still not cleared and he could not grant access at this time. She thanked him. She drove away. She sat in her car on the service road for 20 minutes with a notification letter open in her lap, reading the small print at the bottom left corner with the careful attention of a woman who had been told that details mattered. The letter had a reference number printed in a 9-point font beneath the official seal. She had never noticed it before because nothing in the letter had directed her to look for it. It began with the letters R and M. She wrote it down on her hand in ballpoint pen, and then she drove north until she found the service road he had mentioned. The secondary checkpoint was smaller than the main gate. A single booth, a barrier, a different guard who had not been given a photograph of her, who had not been briefed on her situation, who took her identification and her case number reference and entered it into a system that apparently returned a different set of instructions than the one at the front gate. He made a phone call. He waited. He looked at her car and then at a screen and then he raised the barrier. She drove through before she let herself fully understand that she had driven through. The base was larger than she had imagined from the outside. She followed the administrative signs because they were the only direction she had, parking in a visitor bay outside a low brick building and walking through glass doors into a reception area that smelled of industrial cleaner and recycled air. The woman at the front desk asked her name and the nature of her visit. Camilla gave her name, her husband's name, and the reference number. She said she was there regarding an active case. She did not elaborate. She had learned, in 5 days of being turned away, that elaborating invited more barriers. Brevity was harder to process and slower to redirect. The woman typed. She frowned at her screen. She typed again. She picked up her phone and spoke in a low voice to someone on the other end. Camilla stood very still. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She breathed. The woman put the phone down and told her to wait. She waited for 22 minutes. Then a door at the far end of the reception area opened, and a man in his mid-40s came through it. He was not in uniform. He wore a gray civilian shirt and had the bearing of someone who was used to delivering information and controlling the conditions under which it landed. He introduced himself by first name only. He asked if she would follow him. They walked down a hallway. Then another. The building went further back than it looked from the front. They went through a door that required a badge swipe and down a staircase and into a corridor that was lit differently than the rest of the building. Softer, quieter, with a different quality of air that made the back of Camilla's throat feel slightly warm. The doors along this corridor had no signs. They were plain and numbered. The man in the gray shirt stopped outside door 11. He turned to her and he said, with a steadiness that told her he had delivered versions of this conversation before and had not yet found a version that was easy, that what she was about to see might be different from what she expected. He said that the situation was complicated and that there were things that had happened in a certain order that he would explain fully if she wanted the full explanation. But first he wanted her to know that the person inside this room was alive. She heard the word alive land inside her like something falling from a height. She pressed one hand flat against the wall beside her. The man let her take the moment. He did not rush her. He simply waited. She breathed in through her nose and out slowly and looked at the door numbered 11, and she asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, if it was him. The man said yes. He said it had been a close thing, several times over the past weeks. He said the medical team had needed time to make a proper assessment before they could responsibly communicate the situation to next of kin. He said there were failures in how the notification letter had been handled that he was not here to minimize. He said he was sorry for the suffering that the gap in communication had caused her. She was not listening to the apology. She was looking at door 11. She was placing her hand on the handle. She was pushing it open. And the grief that had been living in her like a stone since the Tuesday in October when the men in uniform appeared on her porch, the grief that had been solid and unmoving and cold, shifted at the first sound she heard from inside that room. A sound she recognized, uneven, quiet, and alive. She did not let herself stop at the doorway. She went in. The room was small and white and very quiet. There was a window on the far wall with the blind partially closed, letting in narrow bars of afternoon light that fell across the bed in even lines. The bed was adjustable, raised slightly at the head. The machines beside it were turned low, their sounds soft and rhythmic in the particular way that medical equipment sounds when it is settled into a long watch rather than an emergency. A bag of fluid hung from a pole. A monitor traced a steady line. And there, in the bed, was Marcus. He was not the same. Camilla had prepared herself, somewhere in the walk down the hallway, for the possibility that he might not look the same. She had prepared herself in the way you prepare for something you cannot fully imagine, by telling yourself you are ready without any real way of knowing if you are. The left side of his face carried the story of what had happened to him, marked by the kind of healing that is still in progress, still working its way through the layers of what the blast had done. His left arm was immobilized. He was thinner. The quietness of the room seemed to sit inside him as much as around him. But his eyes were open, and when she came through the door, his eyes found her. And in the first half-second before either of them spoke or moved, something passed between them that had nothing to do with injuries or machines or closed doors or paperwork or any of the barriers that had been built between them. It was older than all of that. It was the thing that had started at a state fair over a paper bag of kettle corn. It was 11 years. It was real. She crossed the room. She did not say his name, not out loud, not right away. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and she took his right hand in both of hers, and she held it. His hand tightened around hers with the particular strength of someone who has been waiting to hold something for a very long time. She dropped her head. Her shoulders moved. The grief that had been a stone inside her came apart in a different way now. Not gone, not released entirely, but transformed into something that had somewhere to go. It came out of her in the way that grief does when it finally finds the room it was looking for. Marcus said her name. His voice was rougher than she remembered, filtered through weeks of recovery and medication and silence. But it was his voice. Unquestionably his. She pressed his hand tighter, and she told him she was there. She told him she had been trying to get to him. She told him she had driven 6 hours and stood at a gate 4 days in a row and refused to be redirected. She told him she had known something was wrong with the letter. She had known in the way you know things about a person when you have been paying attention to them for 11 years, and their absence has a specific shape that does not match the shape of what you are being told. He listened. His eyes stayed on her face the whole time. She told him everything, and he listened without interrupting because that was Marcus's way. He listened fully, completely, and saved his words for after, the way people do when they understand that being heard is sometimes the thing that matters most. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was sorry she had gone through that. He said it simply, without the late official language he had heard from everyone else in the building. He said he had asked, from the first moment he was lucid enough to ask, about reaching her. He said he had been told it was being handled. He said he had believed that because he had to believe something, because the alternative, the idea that she was at home thinking he was dead while he was lying in a room 2 states away, was not something he could let himself sit inside for too long without losing the ability to keep fighting forward. She asked him what the road ahead looked like. She asked it directly, because she was done with managed language and careful delivery. He told her honestly, There were more surgeries. There was a long rehabilitation. The left arm would recover partially. The face would continue to heal. The spine was the hardest question. He would walk again, the doctors believed, but not the way he had walked before. He said this without self-pity. He said it the way someone says a thing they have already spent a great deal of time making peace with, alone in a quiet room, before the person they love arrived to hear it. She told him they would get through it. He said he knew. She said she was not leaving. He said he knew that too. He said he had known that from the day he met her. He said some people move through the world like weather, unpredictable and passing, and some people move through it like something in the ground, steady and deep and still there in the morning. He said she had always been the second kind. She told him to stop being poetic while attached to a medical drip. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the best sound she had heard in weeks. The investigation that followed the breach of Camilla's notification. The formal review of how the letter had been sent before facts were confirmed, how the access denial had been handled, how the decision to delay next of kin communication had been made and by whom, took several months. There were meetings and reports and the kind of institutional reckoning that tends to result in procedural changes rather than individual accountability, which satisfied almost no one involved but was the shape the machinery chose to take. Daniel Hayes was questioned. He was honest in his answers. He acknowledged that he had provided directional information to the widow of a service member outside the scope of his authorized role. He was reprimanded. The reprimand was placed in his file, where it sat alongside a commendation from the same unit for actions taken the night of the extraction that had helped get 3 men out of a building before the second charge detonated. The two documents lived side by side in his file, which felt, to the people who reviewed it later, like an accurate portrait of what it looks like when a person is trying to do right in a situation that has been made wrong by systems larger than themselves. He was asked, in one of the reviews, why he had helped Camilla find her way in. He said he had served alongside her husband. He said he had watched Marcus take out that photograph for 18 months. He said he knew what it looked like when someone loved something that much. And he said he decided that whatever the cost was to him, it was smaller than the cost of watching a woman stand at a gate every day and know that she was right and not be able to tell her so. Camilla and Marcus never met Daniel Hayes in person. But several months after Marcus was transferred to a rehabilitation center closer to home, a letter arrived at the base addressed to Private Hayes. It was handwritten, 2 pages, in the kind of careful cursive that people use when they want the words to carry more weight than typing allows. It said a great many things. But the part Daniel read more than once, alone in the break room where he had sat so many nights carrying the weight of what he knew, was near the bottom of the second page. It said, "You were the gate and the door at the same time. I do not know how heavy that was, but I know that carrying it the way you did, for as long as you did, and then choosing to open it anyway, that was not a small thing. That was everything." He folded the letter carefully. He held it for a moment. He thought about doors and gates and the difference between them. He put the letter in his breast pocket, and he kept it there,